The blood-curdling scream pierced the dawn silence of Willow Creek like a knife, sending flocks of startled birds into the air and causing Florence Lockhart to bolt upright in her bed, heart pounding against her ribs. It wasn't the first time she'd been woken by screams in this small frontier town. The year 1876 wasn't known for its peace and quiet, but this sound was different. This wasn't the rowdy hollers of drunken men stumbling from the saloon or the excited shouts of gold-fevered prospectors. This was pain, raw and unfiltered. Florence swung her legs over the edge of her bed, bare feet hitting the rough wooden floor of her small room above the general store. At 26, she'd seen enough of life to know when something was truly wrong. She pulled a worn cotton dress over her nightgown, not bothering with the usual layers of petticoats and corsets that society deemed proper. Some things were more important than propriety. Another scream echoed, followed by panic shouting. Florence rushed down the narrow staircase, nearly colliding with Mr. Peterson, the storekeeper, at the bottom. "Miss Lockhart, there's been an accident," he sputtered, eyes wide with concern. "The Dawson girl, she's hurt bad." Florence felt her stomach drop. "Grace." Mr. Peterson nodded grimly. "They're bringing her to Doc Miller's now." Without waiting for more information, Florence darted out the door and into the dusty Main Street. Willow Creek was just stirring to life, the rising sun painting the wooden buildings in hues of gold and orange. A small crowd had gathered outside the doctor's office, their murmurs creating a buzz of tension in the morning air. Florence pushed her way through, her heart in her throat. She'd known Grace Dawson for only the 3 months since the Dawson family had arrived in town, but in that short time, they'd formed a bond. Grace was different from the other women in Willow Creek, adventurous, outspoken, unwilling to be confined by the rigid expectations placed upon women of their time. At 22, she'd already traveled more than most men in town, accompanying her father on his business ventures across the territory. As Florence reached the doctor's porch, the crowd parted to let through 2 men carrying an improvised stretcher. Grace lay upon it, her face ashen beneath smears of dirt and blood, her right arm hanging at an unnatural angle. Her normally vibrant green eyes were closed, long lashes resting against pale cheeks, and her chestnut hair had come loose from its usual neat braid. "What happened?" Florence demanded, following the men into the doctor's office. "Fell from her horse out by Rattlesnake Ridge," one of the men replied, a tall, dust-covered ranch hand Florence didn't recognize. "Horse got spooked by something snake maybe and threw her against the rocks." "Where's her father?" Florence asked, helping to transfer Grace onto the examination table in Doc Miller's surgery. "Heading back from Santa Fe. Won't be here till tomorrow at the earliest." Doc Miller, a gray-haired man with kind eyes and a perpetual frown, bustled in. "Everyone out," he commanded. "Florence, you can stay, I might need your help." The next hour passed in a blur as Florence assisted the doctor, cleaning wounds, holding bandages, and trying not to flinch at Grace's occasional cries of pain when consciousness briefly returned. The injuries were numerous but not life-threatening except for the arm. The bone had broken through the skin, and even Florence, with her limited medical knowledge, could see it wasn't a simple fracture. "It's bad, isn't it?" she whispered to Doc Miller as he worked. The doctor's expression was grim. "She's young and strong, but this arm." He shook his head. "Even if I set it with a break this bad, it'll likely heal wrong. She might never have full use of it again." Florence swallowed hard, looking down at Grace's pale face. For someone so alive, so full of spirit, to be permanently limited seemed particularly cruel. The bell above the doctor's door chimed, and heavy boots thudded across the wooden floor of the outer office. Doc Miller frowned, wiping his blood-stained hands on a towel. "See who that is, would you?" "Tell them I'm busy." Florence nodded, stepping into the front room. A man stood by the door, hat in hand, dust coating his clothes from the trail. He was taller than most men in town, with broad shoulders and a face weathered by sun and wind. His dark hair was longer than was fashionable, curling slightly at the nape of his neck, and a few days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. But it was his eyes that caught Florence's attention, a startling blue, clear and intense against his tanned skin. "Can I help you?" she asked, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance. "Name's Finn Lawson," he said, his voice deep and slightly rough, as if unused to much talking. "Heard there was an accident. Came to see if I could help." Florence tilted her head, studying him. She didn't recognize him from town. "You're not from around here?" "No, madam. Just passing through. I was camped a mile or so from where the girl fell. Heard the commotion, but by the time I got there, these fellows already had her loaded up." He shifted his weight, seeming uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "I've got some experience with broken bones. Thought I might be of use." Before Florence could respond, a cry of pain came from the surgery, making them both turn toward the sound. Finn Lawson's expression hardened, and without waiting for permission, he strode past Florence into the back room. "Sir, you can't just—" Florence started, hurrying after him. "What's going on here?" Doc Miller demanded, looking up from where he was attempting to clean around Grace's broken bone. "Finn Lawson," the man introduced himself again, approaching the table with confident strides. "I've set more bones than I can count. Had to where I come from. Mind if I take a look?" Doc Miller hesitated, then stepped back with a sigh. "Be my guest. I was just telling Miss Lockhart here that it's likely to heal wrong, even if I set it. Girl might never have proper use of it again." Finn leaned over Grace, his movements surprisingly gentle as he examined the injury. His face revealed nothing, but Florence noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. "You're right about one thing," he said finally. "It's a bad break, but I've seen worse heal clean." "How?" Doc Miller asked skeptically. "It needs to be set properly, then splinted in a particular way." Finn straightened, rolling up his sleeves. "I learned it from a Cheyenne medicine man who patched me up after a buffalo hunting accident. Saved my arm, maybe my life." Doc Miller frowned. "Indian medicine? I don't know." "It works," Finn said simply. "I've used it since when needed, but we need to act fast." Florence looked between the two men, then down at Grace, whose face was contorted in pain even in unconsciousness. "Let him try, Doc. What have we got to lose?" After a moment's hesitation, Doc Miller nodded. "All right. What do you need?" The next 2 hours were intense as Finn directed the work, his hands steady and sure as he manipulated the broken bone with a precision that spoke of considerable experience. Florence assisted, following his instructions to prepare strange-smelling poultices from supplies in his saddlebag, and to cut strips of leather for a specially designed splint. Grace regained consciousness during the procedure, her screams turning to whimpers and finally to exhausted silence as Finn finished setting the bone and securing the splint. "It's done," he said finally, stepping back and wiping sweat from his brow. "Now we wait. Will it heal?" Florence asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Finn's blue eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something there, a vulnerability perhaps, beneath the stoic exterior. "If she's strong and if we're lucky, yes. But I won't lie to you. Even with this method, it's a bad break. It'll likely heal wrong." A weak voice joined the conversation. "Then I'll love it that way." They all turned to see Grace's green eyes open, hazy with pain but alert. She looked directly at Finn, a slight smile touching her pale lips. "My arm. If it heals wrong, then I'll just have to love it that way, won't I?" Florence saw something pass between Grace and Finn in that moment, a connection. an understanding. And though she couldn't have explained why, she felt a strange twist in her chest at witnessing it. "That's the spirit, Miss Dawson," Finn said quietly. "That's exactly the spirit you'll need." And in that moment, with the morning sun streaming through dusty windows and the scent of medicine and blood heavy in the air, something shifted in the fabric of their lives, something that would change all three of them forever. Over the next few days, Grace's condition stabilized. Her father, Henry Dawson, returned from Santa Fe in a panic, rushing to his daughter's bedside with fear etched deeply in his face. A successful merchant who had moved west seeking new opportunities, Henry had lost his wife to influenza 2 years prior, leaving Grace as his only family. The bond between father and daughter was strong, forged in shared grief and mutual respect that was unusual for the time. "How could this happen?" Henry demanded, pacing Doc Miller's office while Florence sat beside Grace's bed, gently spooning broth between the injured woman's pale lips. "Papa, please," Grace sighed. "It was my own fault, you know how I ride." Henry's face softened as he looked at his daughter. "Yes, I know, like the wind took human form." He turned to Florence. "Thank you for staying with her." Florence smiled, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. "It's nothing you wouldn't do for anyone else in town." What she didn't say was how quickly she'd grown to care for Grace, this bright, spirited woman who refused to be bound by convention, who spoke her mind and pursued her interests regardless of whether society deemed them appropriate for a lady. In the short time they'd known each other, Grace had become more than just an acquaintance. She'd become a friend, perhaps the first true female friend Florence had ever had. "And this cowboy who helped set her arm," Henry continued. "I'd like to thank him. Where is he staying?" Florence shook her head. "I'm not sure he's staying anywhere. He mentioned he was just passing through." "He's camped by the creek," Grace said, her voice stronger than it had been. "He's been coming to check on the splint. Said he'll be around until he's sure I'm healing properly." Florence felt that same strange twist in her chest that she'd experienced in the surgery. In the chaos of the accident, she hadn't had time to examine the feeling, but now she recognized it for what it was: jealousy. The realization shocked her. She had no claim on Finn Lawson. He was a stranger, a drifter, someone she'd barely exchanged words with. And yet, "I should go thank him properly," Henry said, breaking into her thoughts. "Invite him to stay at our place while he's in town. It's the least we can do." "I'm sure he prefers his freedom, Papa," Grace said, a knowing look in her eye. "Men like him usually do." Florence looked sharply at her friend. "Men like him," Grace smiled, though the expression was tinged with pain. "Wanderers. You can see it in his eyes. He's not the settling type." "And what type would that be?" Florence asked, trying to keep her tone light. "The kind that plants roots, builds a home, stays in one place." Grace shifted against the pillows, wincing as the movement jostled her arm. "Some people aren't meant for fences, Florence. You know that." Florence did know. She'd seen it countless times in Willow Creek, men who came through chasing gold or opportunity, or simply running from their pasts, never staying long enough to become anything more than a story told in the saloon. She'd always considered herself practical enough not to be taken in by such men, no matter how compelling their eyes or gentle their hands. "Well," she said, rising and gathering the empty bowl, "I should get back to the store. Mr. Peterson has been kind enough to give me time off, but I can't impose forever." "You'll come back tonight?" Grace asked, suddenly looking young and vulnerable. "Of course," Florence promised, squeezing her friend's uninjured hand. "Try to rest." As Florence stepped outside into the late afternoon sunlight, she nearly collided with a solid figure on the porch. Strong hands steadied her, and she looked up into Finn Lawson's blue eyes. "Miss Lockhart," he said, releasing her quickly. I was just coming to check on Miss Dawson. Her father's with her now, Florence replied, conscious of the warmth lingering where his hands had touched her arms. He wants to thank you for what you did. Finn nodded, shifting the worn leather saddlebag he carried. Just did what anyone would have given the knowledge. But not everyone has that knowledge. Where did you say you learned it? From a Cheyenne healer. Man named Two Bears. He found me half dead after a hunting accident, patched me up when most white doctors would have taken the arm. Finn's expression grew distant. Taught me a lot during the weeks I was healing. Figured the least I could do was pass it on when needed. Florence studied him, curious about this man who spoke of Indians with respect rather than the usual disdain or fear. You've lived an interesting life, Mr. Lawson. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Just lived, madam, no different than most. She doubted that very much but didn't press. How long will you stay in Willow Creek? Until I'm sure the girl's arm is healing right after that. He shrugged. The trail calls. Always moving on. Florence asked, unable to keep a slight edge from her voice. Finn's eyes sharpened on her face. It's what I know. Before Florence could respond, the door opened behind them and Henry Dawson emerged. Mr. Lawson, I was hoping to catch you. I owe you my deepest gratitude for helping my daughter. The two men shook hands, and Florence used the opportunity to slip away, confused by her own reaction to the drifter. As she walked back to the general store, she scolded herself for being foolish. Finn Lawson was exactly the type of man she'd always known to avoid, rootless, restless, here today and gone tomorrow. The fact that her heart beat faster in his presence was simply a reaction to the drama of the situation, nothing more. And yet, as she helped Mr. Peterson inventory new shipments of canned goods and fabric, her mind kept returning to the gentleness of Finn's hands as he treated Grace, the knowledge in his eyes, the way he spoke of learning from the Cheyenne with respect rather than dismissal. You seem distracted today, Miss Lockhart, Mr. Peterson observed as she mismarked the price of flour for the third time. Just tired, she replied, forcing a smile. It's been a long few days with Grace's accident. Kind of you to help out like you have, the older man said, his eyes twinkling behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Though I suspect that Cowboy could have managed just fine on his own. Capable-looking fellow, isn't he? Florence felt heat rise to her cheeks. I wouldn't know. I was just doing what needed to be done. Mr. Peterson chuckled. Of course. Say, I heard Henry Dawson invited him to stay at their place while he's in town. Guess he turned it down, though. Man prefers his own company, apparently. This information shouldn't have interested Florence, but she couldn't help asking. He's still camping by the creek, then. So I heard. Might be for the best. Town's got enough to gossip about without a strange man staying under the same roof as an unmarried young lady, even with her father present. Mr. Peterson shook his head. Though if anyone could ignore gossip, it'd be the Dawsons. Not exactly ones for convention, are they? Florence thought of Grace's independence and Henry's progressive views on his daughter's education and freedoms. No, they're not. It's refreshing, actually. Refreshing to some, scandalous to others, Mr. Peterson replied with a shrug. Mrs. Whitaker nearly had a conniption when she saw Grace riding astride in trousers last month. Said it was an affront to decency. Florence couldn't help but smile at the memory of the town's most proper matron's horrified expression. Mrs. Whitaker finds most things affronting. That she does, Mr. Peterson agreed. Speaking of which, you should probably take the back stairs up to your room tonight. She's hosting her sewing circle, and they've been clucking about you spending so much time at the doctor's office with that cowboy. Wouldn't want to give them more to gossip about. Florence sighed, unsurprised but annoyed nonetheless. Heaven forbid a woman should help care for an injured friend or work alongside a man without impropriety being assumed. That's small-town life for you, Mr. Peterson said kindly. People talk because there's precious little else to do. Don't let it bother you too much. But as Florence finished her work and prepared to return to Doc Miller's to check on Grace, she found herself increasingly irritated. Why should she care what Mrs. Whittaker and her cronies thought? She'd done nothing wrong, nothing improper. And yet, the weight of their judgment, their assumptions, pressed on her like a physical thing. It was this very pressure that had driven her west 3 years ago, following the death of her parents. Back in Boston, as a woman approaching spinsterhood with limited means, her options had narrowed to either becoming a burden on distant relatives or accepting the first marriage proposal that came her way, regardless of her feelings. The frontier had offered another choice: independence, the chance to make her own way without constant scrutiny, or so she had thought. The reality was that small towns, no matter how far from civilization they might be, carried their own rigid social codes. Sometimes Florence wondered if she'd merely exchanged one cage for another. These thoughts occupied her mind so completely that she didn't notice the rider approaching until he was alongside her on the dusty path to the doctor's office. Miss Lockhart. She started, looking up to find Finn Lawson atop a magnificent buckskin gelding, the evening sun casting his features in gold and shadow. "Mr. Lawson," she acknowledged, nodding politely. "You heading to check on Miss Dawson?" he asked, slowing his horse to match her walking pace. "I am." "Mind if I walk with you? I was just heading there myself." Florence hesitated, thinking of Mrs. Whittaker's sewing circle and their wagging tongues. Then, with a surge of defiance, she nodded. "Not at all." Finn dismounted in one fluid motion, leading his horse beside her. They walked in silence for a moment, the only sounds the soft thud of the horse's hooves and the distant calls of birds settling in for the evening. "You've known Miss Dawson long?" Finn finally asked. "A few months. The Dawsons arrived in spring. You seem close." Florence glanced at him, trying to read his expression in the fading light. Grace is easy to become close to. She searched for the right words. "She's unlike anyone I've ever met." Finn nodded. "I can see that. Strong spirit." "Yes," Florence agreed, surprised by his perception. "Exactly that." They lapsed into silence again, but it felt comfortable now rather than awkward. Florence found herself studying his profile from the corner of her eye, the straight nose, the firm jaw, the way his hair curled slightly where it met his collar. He was handsome, certainly, but it was more than that. There was a quiet confidence about him, a self-containment that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin. "People are talking," she said suddenly, surprising herself. Finn glanced at her. "About you, me, Grace." Florence shrugged, attempting nonchalance. "Small towns run on gossip. Does it bother you?" The direct question caught her off guard. It shouldn't. But it does," he concluded. Florence sighed. "Sometimes. It feels like no matter how far I go, I can't escape certain expectations. Certain judgments." Finn was quiet for a long moment. "That's why I keep moving," he finally said, his voice low. "Harder for expectations to catch up when you don't stay in one place too long." "Is that the only reason?" she asked, genuinely curious now. He smiled slightly, the expression transforming his solemn features. "No, there's also the horizon. Always wanted to see what's beyond it ever since I was a boy, and have you seen what's beyond it?" "Just found another horizon," he said simply. "Always more to see." There was something both romantic and sad about his perspective, Florence thought. Freedom, yes, but also perpetual restlessness, never belonging anywhere completely. "Don't you ever get lonely?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. Finn looked at her directly then, his blue eyes intense. Sometimes. But loneliness finds people in settled places too, doesn't it? The question hit uncomfortably close to home. Florence had felt loneliness keenly in Willow Creek, despite being surrounded by people she saw daily. There was a difference between being known and being understood. Before she could respond, they reached Doc Miller's office. Through the window, they could see Grace sitting up in bed, animated as she spoke with her father. The sight of her friend looking so improved lifted Florence's spirits immediately. "She's looking better," Finn observed. "Yes," Florence agreed. "Thanks to you." "Thanks to her own strength," he corrected. "I just helped a little." As they climbed the steps to the porch, Florence was struck by how natural it felt to be walking beside this man she barely knew. It was a dangerous feeling, she reminded herself. Finn Lawson would be gone as soon as Grace was on the mend, back to chasing horizons, while she remained in Willow Creek, subject to its judgments and limitations. But for now, as they entered the warmth of the doctor's office together, Florence allowed herself to enjoy the simple pleasure of his company, pushing thoughts of tomorrow aside for just a little while. The next 2 weeks fell into a rhythm that soon became familiar. Each morning, Florence would help in the general store until midday, then spend her afternoons with Grace, whose strength returned a little more each day. Finn would appear like clockwork in the late afternoon, checking the splint, applying fresh poultices, and sharing stories that made Grace laugh despite her pain. As the days passed, Florence found herself looking forward to these afternoon meetings more than she cared to admit. Finn was unlike any man she'd known, thoughtful, observant, with a quiet humor that emerged unexpectedly. He spoke little of himself, deflecting personal questions with practiced ease, but through his stories of travels across the frontier, Florence began to piece together the outlines of his life. He'd been born in Kentucky, the son of a horse breeder, but had left home at 17 after his parents died in a fire. He'd worked as a buffalo hunter, a trail guide, a ranch hand, moving constantly across the expanding Western territories. During the war, he'd served as a scout for the Union Army, though he spoke little of that time. And somewhere along the way, after the hunting accident, he'd spent months with the Cheyenne, learning their medicine and earning their respect, a rare thing for a white man in these times of increasing conflict between settlers and native tribes. "You should write these stories down," Grace said one afternoon, as Finn finished recounting an encounter with a grizzly bear in the Montana Territory. "They'd make a wonderful book." Finn shook his head, looking almost embarrassed. "I'm no writer, just a man who's seen some things." "Florence could help you," Grace suggested, her green eyes bright with mischief as she glanced between them. "She writes beautifully. I've seen her journal." Florence felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Grace, that was private." "I didn't read it," Grace protested. "I just saw you writing in it. You looked so absorbed, like you were creating whole worlds on those pages." Finn looked at Florence with new interest. "You're a writer?" "No," she said quickly. I write sometimes for myself." "What about?" he asked. Florence hesitated, unused to discussing her private thoughts. "Just observations. Ideas. Things I wish were different." "She's being modest," Grace cut in. "Florence has the soul of a poet. You should hear her talk about the sunset over the mountains or the way the wildflowers bloom after rain." "Grace, please," Florence said, mortified now. "Mr. Lawson doesn't want to hear about my scribblings." "I wouldn't be so sure," Finn said quietly, those blue eyes studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I think there's a lot about you that's worth hearing, Miss Lockhart." The moment hung between them, charged with something Florence was afraid to name, until Grace broke it with a theatrical yawn. "I'm feeling rather tired suddenly," she announced, eyes twinkling. Perhaps you two should continue this conversation outside while I rest." Florence shot her friend a warning look, but Grace merely smiled innocently. "Actually," Finn said, rising from his chair beside Grace's bed, "I do need to check on something in town. Would you care to walk with me, Miss Lockhart? I could use your guidance." Though she knew it was a transparent excuse, Florence found herself nodding. "Of course, if Grace is sure she doesn't need me." "Positive," Grace said firmly. "Go, enjoy the sunshine." Outside, the late June day was warm but pleasant, a light breeze carrying the scent of pine from the distant mountains. Florence felt suddenly shy as she walked beside Finn, conscious of curious glances from townspeople they passed. "I don't actually need anything in town," Finn admitted after they'd gone a block in silence. Florence smiled despite herself. "I suspected as much. But I did want to talk to you." He hesitated, then gestured toward a small bench in front of the church. "Could we sit for a moment?" Curious, Florence nodded, settling onto the bench and smoothing her skirts. Finn sat beside her, leaving a proper distance between them, his hat in his hands. "I've been thinking about moving on," he said after a moment, his voice low. "Miss Dawson is healing well. The splint can come off in another week or so, and I've stayed in one place longer than usual." Though she'd expected this, Florence felt a sharp pang of disappointment. "I see," she said, striving to keep her voice neutral. "Where will you go?" "I was thinking California." "Never seen the Pacific Ocean." He twisted his hat in his hands, a gesture she'd come to recognize as one of his few tells of uncertainty. "Before I go, though, I wanted to ask you something." Florence's heart beat faster. "Yes. These past 2 weeks, spending time with you and Miss Dawson." He paused, seeming to search for words. "It's been different from what I'm used to. Good different." "For me too," Florence admitted softly. Finn looked at her then, his expression more open than she'd ever seen it. "I've been wondering what it might be like, to stay somewhere. For a while, at least." Florence held her breath, afraid to hope. "Here, you mean, in Willow Creek? Here, where you are?" He said it simply, directly, without artifice or elaborate declaration. Before Florence could respond, a sharp voice cut through the moment. "Well, isn't this cozy?" They both looked up to see Mrs. Whittaker standing before them, her pinched face alight with malicious interest. Beside her stood 2 other women from her sewing circle, fans fluttering as they took in the scene. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Whittaker," Florence said, rising quickly from the bench. "Mr. Lawson and I were just discussing Grace Dawson's recovery." "I'm sure you were," Mrs. Whittaker said, her tone making it clear she believed nothing of the sort. "How dedicated you've been to that girl's care, and with such handsome assistance, too." Her gaze raked over Finn, who had also stood, his face once again composed into its usual unreadable mask. "Miss Dawson suffered a serious injury," he said evenly. "Miss Lockhart has been kind enough to help with her care." "Yes, I've heard all about your medical expertise, Mrs." Whittaker sniffed. "Learned from savages, wasn't it? How very unusual." Florence felt a flash of anger. "Mr. Lawson saved Grace's arm with his knowledge, Mrs. Whittaker. I think that would merit gratitude rather than condescension." Mrs. Whittaker's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Florence. Your position in this town is precarious enough without adding scandal to it. A respectable woman doesn't spend her days in the company of strange men, particularly men who consort with Indians." She turned to her companions. "Come, ladies, we have more important matters to attend to." As the women swept away, Florence stood rigid, humiliation and anger burning in equal measure. She'd been naive to think she could escape judgment, even here on the frontier. "I'm sorry," Finn said quietly when they were alone again. "I didn't mean to cause you trouble." Florence looked at him, really looked at him, and in that moment made a decision. "You didn't cause anything. Mrs. Whittaker and women like her. They're why I left Boston, to escape being told how to live, who to be. She took a deep breath. I'm tired of it, Finn. Tired of caring what people think. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and she saw the recognition of that flicker in his eyes. What were you going to ask me? She pressed, suddenly determined. Before we were interrupted, Finn studied her face as if measuring her resolve. I was going to ask if you might consider coming with me when I go. The request stunned her. Leave Willow Creek, see what's beyond that horizon. His voice was gentle, but his eyes held her steadily. I know it's sudden, I know we barely know each other, but sometimes. He trailed off, then continued more softly. Sometimes you meet someone and you just know they're meant to be part of your story. Florence's mind raced. Leave everything she knew, her job, her small room, the security she'd built for herself. It was madness. And yet, I need time, she whispered, to think. Finn nodded, understanding in his gaze. Of course. I won't be leaving for at least another week, not until Miss Dawson's splint comes off. He hesitated, then added, whatever you decide, Florence, know that these weeks have meant something to me. More than I expected. As he turned to go, Florence found her voice again. Finn, he looked back, waiting, thank you for asking. A smile touched his lips, warming his eyes. Thank you for not immediately saying no. As Florence watched him walk away, his tall figure cutting a distinctive silhouette against the late afternoon sky, she felt as though she stood at a crossroads. Behind her lay safety, predictability, and the cage of others' expectations. Ahead, unknown territory, both frightening and exhilarating. That evening, as she sat beside Grace's bed, Florence was unusually quiet, her thoughts consumed by Finn's unexpected invitation. Grace, perceptive as always, noticed immediately. You're 1,000,000 miles away, she observed. What's happened? Florence hesitated, then decided to confide in her friend. Finn asked me to go with him when he leaves. Grace's eyes widened. To California. Yes. And what did you say? That I needed time to think. Florence sighed, twisting her hands in her lap. It's crazy, isn't it? I barely know him. Grace was silent for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Do you want to go? I don't know, Florence admitted. Part of me does a part I didn't even know existed until recently, but it's so impractical, so reckless. Reckless isn't always bad, Grace said softly. Sometimes it's just another word for brave. Florence looked at her friend, this young woman who rode astride in trousers and spoke her mind freely, who faced her injury with courage and humor. You'd go, wouldn't you, if you were me? In a heartbeat, Grace confirmed with a smile. But I'm not you, Florence. You have to decide what you want, not what I or anyone else would do. What would I even do in California? Florence mused, half to herself. I have no skills beyond shopkeeping, no money beyond my small savings. You have your mind, your heart, your writing. Grace shifted against her pillows, wincing slightly as her arm moved. And you'd have Finn. That's not nothing, Florence. He's a drifter, Florence protested. Always moving. What kind of life is that? The kind where you're free, Grace said simply. Free to choose your path each day, to see new things, meet new people. Isn't that what you wanted when you left Boston? Freedom. It was, Florence realized. Freedom had been exactly what she sought, though she'd settled for a more limited version than she'd dreamed of. The thought of truly embracing that freedom was terrifying and thrilling. What if it doesn't work out? She asked quietly. What if we're halfway to California and he decides he doesn't want me along after all? Or I realize I've made a terrible mistake. Grace reached out with her good hand, gripping Florence's firmly. Then you make a new plan. You're not helpless, Florence. You're one of the strongest women I know. Florence squeezed her friend's hand, grateful for her confidence even if she didn't fully share it. I'll think about it. Good, Grace said, settling back with a satisfied smile. "Now help me with this novel, will you? I'm going mad with boredom." The next few days passed in a blur as Florence wrestled with her decision. By day, she worked in the store, visited Grace, and occasionally walked with Finn, their conversations growing deeper as they tentatively explored the connection between them. By night, she lay awake, weighing her options and examining her fears. On the 5th day after Finn's invitation, Florence was returning from checking on Grace when she heard raised voices from the saloon. Normally, she would have hurried past. The saloon was no place for a respectable woman, but something made her pause when she heard Finn's name mentioned. "Lawson thinks he's something special with his Indian medicine and his fancy talk," a slurred voice was saying. "Reckon he needs to be taught his place." "Leave it be, Davis," another man cautioned. "Man ain't done nothing to you." "Seen him walking with the Lockhart woman," the first voice persisted. "Getting above himself, and I heard he's been staying at the Dawson place this past week." Florence stiffened. It was true that Henry had finally convinced Finn to take a room at their house rather than continue camping by the creek, but there was nothing improper about the arrangement. Grace was still recovering, and having Finn close by to monitor her arm made perfect sense. "So what if he is?" the second man asked. "Ain't none of your business." "Makes it my business when outsiders come in thinking they can take our women," Davis insisted, his voice growing louder. "First he saves the Dawson girl playing hero, and now he's courting the Lockhart woman. Man needs to know his place." Florence had heard enough. She hurried on toward the general store, her mind racing. The last thing Willow Creek needed was trouble, especially with men like Davis, known for his quick temper and quicker fists when drunk. She needed to warn Finn to be careful. But when she reached the store, she found Mr. Peterson in a state of agitation. "Florence, there you are. I've been waiting for you." "What's wrong?" she asked, immediately concerned by his expression. The older man hesitated, then sighed. "I've been meaning to tell you for a few days now, but the timing never seemed right." He gestured toward the small office at the back of the store. "Perhaps we should sit down." With a sense of foreboding, Florence followed him into the office, taking the seat he offered across from his cluttered desk. "I've received a letter from my sister in Denver," Mr. Peterson began, removing his spectacles and polishing them nervously. "Her health is failing and she's asked me to come live with her, to help manage her affairs." Florence felt a chill of understanding. "You're selling the store?" "Yes," he confirmed sadly. "I've already found a buyer, a man from St. Louis looking to establish himself out west. He's eager to take possession as soon as possible." "I see," Florence said, trying to process this sudden change. "When will you be leaving?" "End of next week." Mr. Peterson looked genuinely regretful. "I wish I could give you more notice, my dear. You've been an excellent assistant, and I'd recommend you highly to the new owner, but he's bringing his own family. His wife and daughter will be working alongside him." The implication was clear. Florence would be out of both a job and a home. Her small room above the store would go to the new family. "I understand," she said, mind already calculating her options. Her savings were modest enough to sustain her for perhaps a month while she looked for new work. But positions for single women in frontier towns were limited. She could try for a job at the hotel or perhaps offer to tutor children. "There's more," Mr. Peterson said, interrupting her thoughts. "Mrs. Whittaker came to see me yesterday." Florence tensed. "Oh," she expressed, "concerns about your reputation." Mr. Peterson looked deeply uncomfortable. "I told her it was none of my business who you associated with, but she was quite insistent that your friendship with Mr. Lawson has become a topic of considerable gossip." "Mrs. Whittaker should mind her own affairs," Florence said tightly. "I agree," Mr. Peterson sighed. But you know how these small towns work, Florence. Gossip can make life very difficult, especially for a woman on her own. Florence stood abruptly. Thank you for telling me, Mr. Peterson. I appreciate your candor and I wish you and your sister well. She paused at the door. When does the new owner arrive? Tuesday next, he replied. Florence, I truly am sorry. She nodded, unable to speak further, and climbed the stairs to her small room. Once inside, with the door firmly shut, Florence allowed herself a moment of pure panic. In the space of 10 minutes, her carefully constructed life had crumbled. No job, no home, and now, thanks to Mrs. Whittaker's vicious tongue, potentially no reputation either. As the initial shock faded, however, a strange calm settled over her. Perhaps this wasn't a disaster, but an opportunity, the push she needed to make a decision she might otherwise have hesitated over indefinitely. Florence crossed to the small desk beneath her window, pulled out her journal, and began to write, clarifying her thoughts as the words flowed onto the page. By the time darkness fell, she had her answer. The next morning, Florence made her way to the Dawson house on the outskirts of town. It was a handsome 2-story structure, one of the nicer homes in Willow Creek, reflecting Henry Dawson's success as a merchant. As she approached the front door, it swung open, revealing Finn himself. Florence, he said, surprise evident in his voice. I was just heading out to check on some horses Henry's considering purchasing. I need to talk to you, Florence said, her voice steadier than she felt. It's important. Something in her expression must have conveyed her urgency, for Finn nodded immediately. Of course, come in. He led her into the comfortable parlor where a cheerful fire warded off the morning chill. Grace is still sleeping, he explained, and Henry's in town on business. Good, Florence said, removing her bonnet and setting it aside. What I have to say is for you alone, at least for now. Finn waited, those blue eyes focused entirely on her, patient and attentive. I've made my decision, she said, meeting his gaze directly. I want to go with you to California. A myriad of emotions crossed his face: surprise, pleasure, and something deeper that made her heart beat faster. What changed? He asked softly. You seemed unsure. Florence explained about Mr. Peterson selling the store, her imminent loss of both job and home, and Mrs. Whittaker's campaign of gossip. So you see, there's little left for me in Willow Creek now. Finn frowned. I don't want you to come with me just because you have nowhere else to go. That's not why, Florence assured him quickly. It's just, the timing seems significant, doesn't it? As if the universe is clearing my path, removing obstacles I might have used as excuses to stay. And if those obstacles weren't being removed, Finn pressed, moving closer to her. If you still had your job, your room, your place in town, would you still want to come? Florence considered the question carefully, wanting to be absolutely honest with him and with herself. Yes, she said finally. It would have been harder to decide, harder to leave, but yes, I would still want to come with you. Why? His voice was gentle, but the question demanded an answer she'd been avoiding. Florence took a deep breath. Because when I'm with you, I feel possibilities, things I'd forgotten how to imagine, and because the thought of watching you ride away without me feels like. She struggled to find the words. Like closing a door I was meant to walk through. Finn's expression softened, and he took her hands in his touch warm and sure. I've never asked anyone to come with me before, he said quietly. Never wanted to. Until you. The simple admission touched Florence deeply. I'm not expecting promises, she said. I know this might not be forever, but I want to try. I want to see what could be. So do I, Finn said, his thumbs tracing gentle circles on the backs of her hands. More than I can say. Florence looked up at him, this man who had walked into her life so unexpectedly and changed its course entirely. In his eyes, She saw the same mixture of hope and uncertainty that she felt herself in something else, something that made her pulse quicken and her breath catch. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Finn leaned down and brushed his lips against hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, over almost before it began. But as he started to withdraw, Florence rose on her toes, her hands moving to his shoulders, and kissed him back with all the certainty she suddenly felt. When they finally broke apart, both a little breathless, Finn rested his forehead against hers. "When do you want to leave?" he asked. "As soon as Grace's splint can come off," Florence replied. "I won't go until I know she's healing properly." Finn smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I was hoping you'd say that. I wouldn't feel right leaving her care half-finished either." The sound of movement from upstairs made them step apart, though Finn kept hold of one of Florence's hands, as if reluctant to break the connection between them. "We should tell Grace," Florence said, suddenly nervous about her friend's reaction. Though Grace had encouraged her to consider Finn's invitation, actually accepting it, preparing to leave Willow Creek, and the first real friendship Florence had formed, there was another matter entirely. "Tell me what?" Grace's voice came from the staircase, where she stood in her dressing gown, her splinted arm held carefully against her body. Florence and Finn exchanged a glance, then Florence moved to help her friend into the parlor. "You shouldn't be up and about alone yet," she scolded gently. "What if you'd fallen? Then I'd have called for help," Grace said pragmatically, allowing herself to be settled on the sofa. Her green eyes moved between Florence and Finn, noting their clasped hands with evident satisfaction. "Now, what were you going to tell me?" Florence took a deep breath. "I've decided to go with Finn to California. After your splint comes off." To her surprise, Grace broke into a delighted smile. "I knew it. I told Papa just last night that you two would be leaving together." "You're not upset?" Florence asked, relieved but puzzled by her friend's enthusiasm. Grace reached out to squeeze Florence's free hand. "Why would I be upset? You're following your heart, that's all I've ever wanted for you." "But we've become such friends," Florence said, feeling tears prick at her eyes. "I'll miss you terribly." "And I'll miss you," Grace acknowledged, her own eyes growing suspiciously bright. "But this isn't goodbye forever. California isn't the moon, you know, and besides—" She exchanged a glance with Finn, a conspiratorial look that immediately made Florence suspicious. "Besides what?" she demanded, looking between them. "Perhaps you should tell her the rest," Grace suggested to Finn, settling back against the sofa cushions with an expectant expression. Finn cleared his throat, suddenly looking slightly uncomfortable. "I may have spoken to your father about certain business opportunities in California," he admitted to Grace. "Mining investments, specifically." "Mining," Florence repeated, confused. "My father has been looking to diversify his investments," Grace explained. Finn mentioned some promising opportunities near Sacramento gold and silver mines that need capital to expand. "I worked the area for a while," Finn added. "Know some of the operations, the men running them. Henry's interested in potentially partnering with a few of the more promising ones." "Which would mean?" Florence began, starting to understand. "Which would mean Papa and I might need to visit California ourselves before too long," Grace finished, her eyes twinkling. "To inspect these investments personally, you understand." Florence laughed, the sound bubbling up from a well of joy she hadn't realized existed within her. "You schemed this." "Not schemed exactly," Finn protested, though his lips twitched with suppressed amusement. "Just mentioned some genuine opportunities to a businessman always looking for new ventures. And if those opportunities happen to be in the same place where my dear friend will be living," Grace added innocently, "well, that's just a happy coincidence, isn't it?" Florence shook her head, overwhelmed with gratitude for these two people who had come into her life so recently yet had already changed it so profoundly. "You're both impossible, but you love us anyway," Grace said confidently. "Yes," Florence agreed softly, her eyes meeting Finn's. "I do." The remaining days before their planned departure passed in a whirlwind of activity. Florence gave notice to Mr. Peterson, who wished her well with genuine affection. She carefully packed her few possessions, selling what she couldn't take and adding the money to her modest savings. Most importantly, she spent as much time as possible with Grace, whose arm was healing remarkably well under Finn's continued care. 5 days before they were set to leave, Finn removed Grace's splint, revealing an arm that was noticeably crooked but functional. "It healed wrong, as we expected," he said as he gently manipulated the limb, testing its range of motion. "But with exercises and time, you'll regain most of its use." Grace flexed her fingers experimentally, wincing a little but looking pleased nonetheless. "It's a good reminder," she said, studying the misshapen angle of her forearm. "Of what?" Florence asked. "That broken things can still be beautiful, still useful." Grace smiled, the expression lighting her face. "It'll always look different from my other arm, but that doesn't make it less valuable." "It'll heal wrong," Finn quoted softly, meeting Grace's eyes with understanding. "Then I'll love it that way," Grace completed, the words she'd spoken that first day in Doc Miller's surgery coming full circle. Florence felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by the simple wisdom in her friend's acceptance. There was a metaphor there, she thought, about life and its unexpected breaks and bends, how sometimes what seemed like a tragedy could lead to growth, to beauty of a different kind. The night before their departure, Henry Dawson insisted on hosting a small farewell dinner. Besides Florence and Finn, he invited Doc Miller and Mr. Peterson, the only people in town who had shown genuine support for Florence's decision. "A toast," Henry announced as they sat around the elegantly set dining table, raising his glass of fine Kentucky bourbon. "To new beginnings and brave hearts. To California," Doc Miller added with a twinkle in his eye. "May it be all you hope for." "To friendship that spans any distance," Grace said, her gaze warm on Florence's face. "And to healing," Finn concluded quietly, his eyes moving from Grace's arm to Florence's face. "In all its forms." As the glasses clinked and conversation flowed, Florence felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. Whatever lay ahead, whatever joys or challenges waited beyond that distant horizon, she was ready to face it. Not alone, as she had been for so long, but with Finn at her side, and the knowledge that true friendship could indeed span any distance. The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect for travel. Florence stood on the Dawsons' front porch, wrapped in a tearful embrace with Grace. "Write to me," Grace insisted, pulling back to look Florence in the eye. "Every detail. I want to know everything about California." "I will," Florence promised, "and you'll visit soon." "As soon as Papa finalizes the investments," Grace confirmed. 2 months, 3 at most." Henry Dawson stepped forward to shake Finn's hand firmly. "Take care of her," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "I will, sir," Finn replied solemnly. "You have my word." "And you," Henry said, turning to embrace Florence, "take care of him too. I suspect he needs it more than he'll admit." Florence smiled through her tears. "I suspect you're right." With final hugs and promises to write often, Florence mounted the sturdy mare Henry had insisted on giving her as a parting gift, settling into the saddle with the ease of someone who had spent considerable time practicing over the past weeks. Beside her, Finn sat tall on his buckskin gelding, their pack horses loaded with supplies for the journey. "Ready?" he asked softly, his blue eyes searching her face. Florence took one last look at the Dawson house, at Grace standing on the porch waving, at the town of Willow Creek spread out below them in the distance. This place that had been her home, however imperfectly, for 3 years. Then she turned to Finn, to the open road ahead, to the future they would build together, whatever shape it might take. "Ready," she confirmed, and together they urged their horses forward, riding side by side toward the waiting horizon. The journey to California was long and arduous, as Florence had expected, but also filled with wonder she could never have anticipated. They traveled first to Denver, where they joined a wagon train heading west, safety in numbers being the wisest course through territories still marked by conflict between settlers and native tribes. Along the way, Florence experienced her first real glimpse of the vastness of the American frontier. Endless prairies where tall grasses rippled like golden seas, towering mountains that seemed to scrape the very sky, deserts so stark and beautiful they brought tears to her eyes. And through it all, there was Finn, steady, patient, teaching her to ride properly, to set up camp, to read the weather and the land. At night, they sat by their campfire, sometimes talking for hours, sometimes simply existing in comfortable silence as the stars wheeled overhead in a dazzling display city dwellers never truly saw. They faced dangers together. A lightning-sparked prairie fire that forced them to outride the flames. A river crossing where Florence's horse lost its footing, plunging her into icy currents until Finn pulled her to safety. A brief, tense encounter with a band of Paiute warriors who ultimately let them pass unharmed after Finn spoke to them in their own language, his respect for their ways evident in every gesture. Through these shared experiences, the connection between them deepened, transforming from attraction and mutual respect into something Florence could only call love, though neither had spoken the word aloud yet, as if waiting for the right moment, the right place. That place, it turned out, was a hillside overlooking the Sacramento Valley, where they reined in their horses after cresting a final ridge to find California spread before them like a promised land. "It's beautiful," Florence breathed, taking in the panorama of rolling hills, oak-studded valleys, and distant mountains. After months of travel, they had finally reached their destination. "Yes," Finn agreed, but when she turned to him, she found him looking not at the vista but at her. "Beautiful?" Florence felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. The journey had changed her, she knew that. Her skin was tanned from the sun, her hands calloused from work, her body stronger and more resilient than she'd ever been. Her carefully arranged hair had long since given way to practical braids, and her once fashionable traveling dress had been replaced by the more practical divided skirt and jacket she'd commissioned before leaving Willow Creek, scandalizing Mrs. Whittaker, but earning Grace's wholehearted approval. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "I love you," Finn said simply, the words falling into the space between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread forever. Florence's breath caught. Despite everything they'd shared, despite the understanding that had grown between them, hearing those words aloud still had the power to stop her heart. "You don't have to say it back," he continued when she remained silent, his voice gentle. "I just wanted you to know. Before we reach town, before everything changes again. Whatever happens next, whatever you decide you want from life now that we're here, I love you." "Finn Lawson," Florence said, finding her voice at last. "If you think for one moment that I followed you across half a continent just to leave you once we reached California, you haven't been paying attention." A slow smile spread across his face, lighting those blue eyes she'd come to know so well. "Is that so?" "It is," she confirmed, guiding her horse closer to his until their legs brushed. "I love you too." I think I have since that first day in Doc Miller's surgery, when you were so gentle with Grace, so certain you could help her." Finn reached across the small space between them, his hand warm against her cheek. "I was lost before I found you," he said quietly. "Always moving, never belonging anywhere. You changed that. You gave me a reason to stay." "Does that mean you're ready to stop chasing horizons?" Florence asked, only half teasing. Finn's expression grew thoughtful. "I think it means I've found what I was looking for beyond them." He gestured toward the valley below. "But there's still plenty to explore, plenty of adventures to have. The difference is, now I want to have them with you beside me." "I like the sound of that," Florence said, smiling through sudden tears. They descended into the valley as the afternoon light turned golden, reaching the growing settlement of Placerville just as dusk was falling. The town was larger than Willow Creek, more established, with proper streets and substantial buildings, evidence of the prosperity brought by the gold that had first drawn settlers to the area. Finn led them to a modest inn on the outskirts, where they secured separate rooms for propriety's sake, though both knew their hearts were already joined in ways more significant than any formal ceremony could establish. That would come later. They'd agreed during their journey a proper wedding once they were settled, once they knew where and how they wanted to build their life together. Over the next weeks, they explored the area, with Finn introducing Florence to contacts from his previous time in the region. One of these was an elderly couple named the Hendersons, who owned a small ranch about 5 miles outside of town. They had no children and were looking to sell their property, hoping to retire to San Francisco where their niece lived. "It's a good piece of land," Finn told Florence as they rode out to see it one crisp autumn morning. "Not too big, but enough for a decent herd, some crops. The house is solid, too." "Are you thinking of buying it?" Florence asked, surprised. She'd assumed they would settle in town, perhaps open a shop with her experience and the money they'd brought with them. Finn looked uncertain for the first time since she'd known him. "I've been thinking about it. If you'd be amenable. I know it's different from what you're used to." "Tell me what you're imagining," Florence encouraged, curious about this glimpse into Finn's hopes for their future. He relaxed a little, his eyes scanning the landscape as they rode. "I thought we could run some cattle. I know that business from my father, and there's good money in it with the growing towns needing beef. Maybe breed horses too. Quality stock is always in demand out here." "And what would I do on this ranch?" Florence asked, keeping her tone neutral, wanting to understand his vision completely before responding. "Whatever you want," Finn said simply. "Run the household if that interests you. Help with the business side. You're better with figures than I am. Right, like Grace said you were talented at." He glanced at her, a hint of vulnerability in his expression. "I just thought it might be a good place to put down roots, to build something together." Florence was silent for a long moment, considering. The life he described was different from anything she'd known or imagined for herself, more isolated, more physically demanding than running a store or teaching. And yet, would there be room for visitors, she asked finally, for Grace and her father when they come? Finn's face broke into a smile as he realized she was considering the idea seriously. "More than enough room, and we'd be close enough to town for regular visits, for supplies, for society when we want it. A place of our own," Florence mused, warming to the concept. "Where we answer to no one but ourselves." "Exactly." Finn's eyes held hers, full of hope. "What do you think?" Florence looked around at the rolling hills, the open sky, the freedom this land represented. She thought of all the cages she'd left behind: Boston's rigid social hierarchy, Willow Creek's stifling gossip, the limited expectations for women's lives. And she thought of Grace, of her brave declaration in Doc Miller's surgery. "Then I'll love it that way." Life rarely took the shape you expected. Sometimes it broke and healed wrong, crooked, and imperfect. But that didn't make it less valuable, less beautiful. It just made it uniquely yours. "I think," Florence said, smiling at the man who had taught her to embrace the unexpected turns of life, "that I would very much like to see this ranch." The Henderson Ranch turned out to be everything Finn had described and more. The house was modest but solidly built, with 4 rooms downstairs and 2 more under the eaves, plenty of space for them, and for future growth, whether that meant children or frequent visitors. A large barn stood nearby, along with various outbuildings and corrals. The land stretched for nearly 200 acres, with good water access from a year-round creek and plenty of grazing for cattle. As Mr. Henderson showed them around, his wife walking alongside Florence, it was easy to see how much they had loved this place, how much care they had put into building it over their 30 years of marriage. "It's a good life, Mrs. Henderson told Florence quietly as they paused to watch Finn and Mr. Henderson inspect the barn. "Hard work, yes, but rewarding, and there's a freedom to it you won't find elsewhere." "Were you ever lonely?" Florence asked, the one concern that had nagged at her since considering the idea. Mrs. Henderson smiled, understanding in her kind eyes. "Sometimes in the early years, but you make connections with neighboring ranches, with folks in town. And there's a different kind of companionship that grows between a husband and wife when you're building something together, facing challenges side by side." She patted Florence's hand. "Besides, you strike me as a woman with resources within herself. Those are the women who thrive out here." By the time they rode back to town that evening, both Florence and Finn knew they had found their home. The next day, they made an offer that the Hendersons accepted readily, seeming pleased that their beloved ranch would go to a young couple looking to build a life together. "We should write to Grace," Florence said that night over dinner at the inn. "Tell her where to find us when they come." "And invite them to a wedding," Finn suggested, reaching across the table to take her hand. Florence's heart leaped. "Are you asking me to marry you, Finn Lawson?" His smile was tender, his eyes full of love. "I believe I am, Florence Lockhart. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had known this moment would come, had thought about it during their long journey west, Florence found herself unexpectedly moved by the simple, heartfelt proposal. "Yes," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "Yes, I will." They were married 3 weeks later in Placerville's small church, with only the minister, his wife, and the Hendersons as witnesses. Florence wore a new dress of blue silk that matched Finn's eyes, while he sported a new suit that made him look so handsome she could hardly take her eyes off him. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, both of them speaking their vows with clear voices and full hearts. That evening they rode out to the ranch, their ranch now, as husband and wife. The Hendersons had already moved to San Francisco, leaving the house ready for its new occupants. As they approached, the setting sun gilded the simple wooden structure, making it glow like something from a fairy tale. At the threshold, Finn surprised Florence by sweeping her into his arms. "Tradition," he explained with a smile, carrying her across and setting her gently on her feet in what was now their home. That night, as they came together as husband and wife for the first time, Florence discovered new depths to the connection between them. Finn's touches were tender yet passionate, his whispered words of love making her feel more cherished than she had ever imagined possible. In his arms, she found a belonging she had searched for all her life without fully recognizing it, a sense of being exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly the person she was meant to be with. The weeks that followed were busy ones as they settled into their new home and began the work of making the ranch their own. Florence threw herself into learning ranch life with the same determination she'd brought to their journey west. She learned to cook on the large cast iron stove, to tend the vegetable garden the Hendersons had established, to manage the household accounts with meticulous care. To her surprise, she also found she enjoyed helping with the livestock, especially the horses, which responded well to her patient, gentle approach. Finn, meanwhile, began building their herd, making connections with other ranchers in the area, and establishing their reputation for fair dealing and quality stock. He was in his element, Florence realized, watching him work with the animals or negotiate with buyers. This was the life he'd been born for, the skills passed down from his father finally finding their fullest expression. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of gold and purple. Sometimes they talked for hours, sharing stories or making plans for the ranch's future. Other times they simply existed in companionable silence, each content with their own thoughts and the other's presence. It was during one such evening, about 2 months after their wedding, that Florence finally shared the news she'd been certain of for a week but had kept to herself, wanting to be absolutely sure. "Finn," she said, breaking a comfortable silence, "there's something I need to tell you." He turned to look at her, the last light of day catching in his eyes. "What is it?" Florence took his hand, placing it gently over her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby. Next summer, I think." For a moment Finn seemed frozen, his expression one of complete shock. Then, as the meaning of her words sank in, his face transformed with a joy so pure it brought tears to Florence's eyes. "A baby," he whispered, his hand spreading protectively over her abdomen. "Our baby," Florence nodded, her own happiness too great for words. She had never seen herself as a mother, had never particularly yearned for children the way some women did. But now, carrying this new life created from their love, she felt a fierce, protective joy that surprised her with its intensity. "Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear the words. In answer, Finn drew her into his arms, his kiss conveying everything words could not. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he assured her. "You've given me everything, Florence. A home, a purpose. And now a family I never dreamed." "I know," she said softly, understanding the depth of emotion he couldn't quite express. "I never dreamed either, but here we are." Here they were indeed, a former shop girl from Boston and a drifting cowboy, somehow finding each other against all odds, creating a life together that neither could have imagined before that fateful day in Willow Creek. 2 weeks after Florence's announcement, they received word that Henry and Grace Dawson had arrived in Placerville. Finn rode into town immediately to escort them to the ranch, returning a few hours later with their friends in a rented buggy. Florence stood on the porch, watching the buggy approach with a hand shading her eyes against the bright December sun. As it drew closer, she could make out Grace sitting beside her father, her face alight with excitement. The moment the buggy stopped, Grace was out of it in a flurry of skirts, rushing toward Florence with an exuberant cry. The two women embraced tightly, both laughing and crying at the same time. "Let me look at you," Grace demanded, stepping back but keeping hold of Florence's hands. "You're positively glowing. Ranch life must agree with you." Florence smiled, wondering if her friend would guess the additional reason for her radiance. "It does. Very much. And your arm, it's healing well." Grace extended her right arm, demonstrating its range of motion. Though still noticeably crooked, the limb moved with surprising flexibility. "Better every day. I've been doing the exercises faithfully. Papa's even hired a special tutor who knows about rehabilitating injuries." Henry Dawson joined them, embracing Florence warmly. "You look wonderful, my dear. Marriage clearly suits you." "Thank you," Florence said, genuinely pleased to see him. "Both of you, I've missed you so much." "And we've missed you," Henry assured her, "though your letters have been a bright spot in our weeks." "You write so vividly. Florence, I feel as though I've already seen this place through your words." "Now I get to see it in person," Grace exclaimed, looking around with evident delight. "Oh, Florence, it's perfect, just as you described." "Come inside," Florence invited, linking her arm with Grace's. "I want to show you everything." The next hours were filled with tours and conversation, catching up on all the news that couldn't be conveyed adequately in letters. Henry and Finn discussed the mining investments that had been the official reason for the Dawsons' visit, while Grace and Florence talked of more personal matters, heads close together like sisters sharing secrets. That evening, after a dinner that showcased Florence's rapidly improving culinary skills, the four of them sat around the hearth, warm and comfortable despite the December chill outside. Florence and Finn exchanged a glance, a silent communication passing between them. "We have news to share," Finn announced, his hand finding Florence's. "News we wanted to tell you in person." Grace's eyes widened, immediately guessing. "Florence, are you?" Florence nodded, unable to suppress her smile. "Yes, we're expecting a baby in early summer." The room erupted in exclamations of joy and congratulations. Grace hugged her tightly, whispering, "I'm so happy for you, so very happy." Henry shook Finn's hand firmly, then surprised Florence by embracing her as well. "You'll make wonderful parents," he declared, his eyes suspiciously bright. "And you," Florence said to Grace, "will make a wonderful godmother, if you'll accept the role." Grace pressed a hand to her heart, visibly moved. "I would be honored, more than honored." As the evening continued, plans were made for the Dawsons to extend their stay through Christmas, giving them all time to truly reconnect before Henry needed to return to his business in Willow Creek. Grace, however, asked if she might remain longer, perhaps until the baby comes. She suggested hopefully. "Nothing would make me happier," Florence assured her friend, genuinely pleased at the prospect of having Grace's company during the months ahead. Later that night, after their guests had retired to the rooms prepared for them, Florence stood with Finn on the porch, looking up at the star-strewn sky. "Happy?" he asked softly, his arms encircling her from behind, one hand resting protectively over their growing child. "Completely," she affirmed, leaning back against his solid warmth. "Everything I never knew I wanted I've found with you." Finn chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest against her back. "Strange how life works, isn't it? If Grace hadn't fallen from her horse that day. If you hadn't been camping nearby. If you hadn't been helping at Doc Miller's." Florence turned in his arms, looking up into the face she had come to love more than she had ever thought possible. "1,000 little chances that brought us together." "Not chance," Finn said with quiet certainty. "Fate." As his lips found hers in a kiss that still held all the wonder of their first, Florence thought of Grace's words about her broken arm. "Then I'll love it that way." Life rarely followed the path you expected. It broke and mended in unexpected ways, leading you to places you never imagined. But sometimes, if you were brave enough to embrace those twists and turns, you found yourself exactly where you were meant to be all along. In Finn's arms, with their baby growing between them and dear friends sleeping under their roof, Florence knew with absolute certainty that this was her place, this man, this home, this life they were building together. It might not have been the future she'd once envisioned for herself, but it was infinitely more precious for being unexpected, for being theirs. Under the vast California sky, Florence and Finn Lawson stood at the beginning of their story together, a story of love found in unlikely places, of courage to follow one's heart, of building a life beautiful not despite its imperfections, but because of them. And in that moment, both knew without doubt that whatever challenges or joys lay ahead, they would face them together, loving each other and the life they'd chosen exactly as it was.